So for the next of the Catapult High Performance Practitioner interviews, I'm joined by Ben Jones, who is Professor of Sports Physiology and Performance at Leeds Beckett University and Research and Innovation Manager for the Rugby Football League. Thanks very much for joining us, Ben. Really appreciate you giving some time to us. I think what would probably be useful just to start with would be if you could maybe just give us a sort of a broad brush overview as to your route into both of these roles, really.
So I started through the traditional academic route of undergrad, masters, and during my masters I was really interested in the applied world and seeing it from the other perspective, so seeing what coaches did, what people within the clubs did, alongside learning the theory within the academic side. And I was lucky enough during my masters to start as a volunteer in a professional club, which then gave me an appetite to actually understand more and apply more knowledge in those environments, which I then went on to start a PhD at Leeds Beckett University, where I studied there for 4 years, while continuing to do various applied consultancy jobs in Rugby League, Rugby Union, football, which I felt during my academic research gave me a different perspective of some challenges and problems that we saw from an academic lens. My PhD was very academic in terms of majority lab-based and mechanisms, but actually coming to the end of it, I found it really interesting in terms of why we're generating knowledge, are we applying knowledge, and are we doing both of those efficiently for what I see as an applied science, and an applied science that has a genuine end user, and the end user is the sport, the coach, the athlete. And I suppose that led me to where I am now, which is trying to apply a balanced view to different problems through an academic lens, as in my role as a professor at the university, and also as a research and innovation manager, helping a sport use the information that's out there to make sport better.
So you're actually you're having to, I suppose, navigate this grey area that runs in between your pure academic role as a professor, yet I suppose the tracksuit role when you find yourself in rugby league clubs, in and around the national team and so on. I think it'd be fair to say that as of late, a lot of the research, your own research efforts have actually been in that grey area with very, very applied studies being conducted. I wonder if you'd mind just giving us a little bit of an overview of the sort of projects that you've got on the go at the moment.
So our projects and our research programme ranges from our smaller studies, which are practical and very applied, and they may be acute cross-sectional studies, so we would describe them as relatively quick and they can be used this season within sport. And our philosophy and our approach to research is that if we have a question that's driven from policy or practice, so policy being within a governing body, someone asking something that we don't know the answer to, or practice being a coach asking us a question, or even a question come from our own practice, and we can't answer it from the literature, then we can do a small study to do that. And those studies are really useful because they provide immediate feedback to the club, and we learned during the process. So not only is that about knowledge generation from a research perspective, but it's about knowledge application from a practitioner perspective as well. So that would be one of our approach in terms of trying to do our, I would say, quicker studies, quicker feedback. And I would always almost class those as our the wants of the sport. So they want these to happen because they're quick and they can see an immediate feedback. Behind the scenes, we then have slower studies, which we would describe as almost the needs of the sport, and they would see them next year or the year after. And they would be our multi-club studies. The reality is that they may take 4 years to do, but actually that by the end of that 4 years, we're really confident in what we found to actually help progress. So we're doing a really interesting study at the moment in Rugby Union, collaborating with Professor Keith Stokes from Bath University, where we're looking at the physical development, the training load, and the injury profile of youth Rugby Union players. Now, to do that, which is a big question, we need to fitness test numerous academies 3 times a year. we need to monitor their training load, we need to look at their injury and also look at their, we'll say, life loads, which is kind of the non-training load part of being a youth athlete. That's not going to be quick, it's never going to be an easy win, but actually by going through that process of that comprehensive study, it will take 4 years to do and to finish, but that will give us a really good understanding of actually what future direction should focus on, and also where and highlight some of the challenges that we can then answer through some of the smaller studies.
Actually, what I'd like to do is just go back to something that you said earlier, which I hadn't actually thought about research into sport in this way, but you mentioned about the idea that the wants of the sport are derived from the practitioner, so from the sport itself, and the needs are more derived from the kind of academic questions that emerge from universities. I wonder if you just elaborate on that a little bit, because it's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think that concurrently dealing with the wants and needs of the sport allows us to be progressive in terms of doing something new, while also taking the coach along the journey with us. The best example of that for me is around the use of GPS analysis in sport for game analysis. Now, GPS analysis has been around for 5 years, and I think it's one of the best contributions to sports science, probably in the last decade, not only in terms of the information we're collecting, the knowledge that we have the potential to access, but also the jobs and opportunities that are allowing now expertise into the sports. Now, if you've collected traditionally whole game demands or training demands of a sport, and you use total distance as your outcome. Now, as a coach, that's your reference point. You know what 5K is, you know what 6K is, you know what 4K is. If we then come in as an academic and say, actually, we don't believe total distance has anything to do with either the training outcome, the dose response, or performance, then you're taking something that the coach understands completely away from them, and you're introducing a new language which isn't real. So an example of where we've almost concurrently worked these wants and needs, and it's through some of Dan Weaving's work, is we feed back to the coach their information on total distance. They can also have the player load, they can also have the high speed meters, the meters per minute. But behind the scenes, we're also doing something novel around peak demands of games. We're doing some multivariate analysis, so doing some principal component. Now, if we didn't give them the total distance, the session duration, and we just gave them an arbitrary number which was from the principal component of all our data, it's meaningless. Where actually, what we can do over time is start to feed back the wants of what they know and what they're used to, versus the needs. And eventually, I think what will happen, and this is happening, is their wants and their needs change. So they now want to know more about actually the more innovative training methods, and that's now their reference point. And that's almost, it's almost a strategy to innovation. Innovation is doing one thing different at once until that thing becomes normal, and then you can introduce something else. And once we have our reference point around how hard was training, so it's not about how far they ran, how long it was, it's how long we spent above certain speed thresholds for certain periods of time, then actually that changes the way that the coaches then apply the sports science. And now our next thing is, okay, well, that's only the running. So we've all got that, so now we're doing something with the collision. So we're looking at how the collision can be integrated. But in terms of the wants and the needs, we don't feed the needs back, or what we believe the needs back, until we fully understand them. Because there's so many times in research that you do something, you think it's going to have an outcome, and you get to the end and it didn't do what you thought it did. So that's a behind the scenes, so that it only gets fed back into practice when we fully understand what we're going to find.
So I'm guessing, I mean, the complexity then comes in that you might be working alongside 4, 5, 6 different coaches whom you're taking on the same journey, but they're all going on that journey at different rates, and you're drip feeding and introducing this information, hopefully at an appropriate point on each of these individual journeys. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that everybody, all coaches, in my experience, all coaches are receptive to good applied research when they're taken on that journey. I think that there's only a few coaches that are receptive to research outcomes and findings, because it looks different to what their world's used to, a bar graph, a standard deviation, etc. It's not real. but actually taking coaches along that journey with research. Some focus on the process, some focus on some of the measures we're doing, some focus on what we find, some focus on some of the individual data. But I think that the beauty of what happens is you help the coaches provide clarity and help crystallise their thinking and provide something objective to what is a subjective area, which is sports performance. Yeah. And if we can do this in small components, and we've done it around how long does it take to recover following a contact training session or a non-contact training session. And actually by evaluating those scientifically, the coach starts to understand then the consequence of the activity that they then prescribe, because it's at no point in our work do we ever take the responsibility away from the coach to actually organise training, plan training, deliver training. We're providing objective information for them to make decisions with.
So, to further muddy the water then, I mean, the language that we all use with coaches, I guess, tends to be built around the locomotive metrics that are sort of GPS derived from within these tracking devices. But you mentioned collisions, which is sort of one area in which the inertial sensors in these tracking devices can be leveraged to add value. Have you explored yourself the use of inertial sensor-derived metrics to help explain some of the more subtle micro-movements that may or may not be key performance indicators in the sport of rugby?
No, not yet. I think our journey is to evaluate, to fully understand the locomotive demands, which are, I would say, are well understood now, both in terms of whole game peak, contextual demands. I think our next step is to integrate video with that. And before we get into the detail of why is it happening, which I would say are the inertial sensors, I think we'd like to look at what's happening. So almost interact the video, the frequency of collision, the key outcomes of collisions, whether it's successful or not, before we try and get into any more detail.
Yeah, I get that. Something that we've noticed at Catapult is the way in which people are looking to take information, training and match information is changing, in the sense that we've noticed that whereas historically systems would be sold into clubs and would be operated with one club operating independent of other clubs, it seems that leagues now centrally are taking much more interest, and almost they're looking to perhaps leverage some value from central repositories of data. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just perhaps hypothesising what kind of additional value might be gained from that sort of approach over the satellite approach of just depositing devices in separate clubs.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's an intelligent and smart way to move forward in research. I think for me, that approach highlights the value that research is given now, and people realise that actually pooling data is a way of everybody learning, and it's not a way of sharing competitive advantage, because it's not around the data that they have, it's around how they apply the data and the findings. And I think people are aware that actually, whether it's game demands, training demands, physical characteristics, injury surveillance, information from one club is interesting. When you apply that across a league-wide, actually it becomes really useful then, because then you can start to model actually what is good and bad and average. Yeah. So in terms of the league-wide deals and application of technology into sport, for me it's fantastic and it's a no-brainer, because everybody benefits, because the sharing of data allows the more knowledge to be generated, which allows more knowledge then to be applied back into the sport. And actually I think that I think sports are also interested in that sports are trying to progress themselves. Yeah. So it's not that, yes, within our sport you have teams competing against each other, but then you also have the international element. So if the league's better, that you have a better competitive advantage internationally. If your league's better, you actually have a better product against another sport. So actually the centralising of data, of information, to then generate more knowledge around your product is fantastic, and I think it will almost exponentially increase what we know and what we understand about sport.
So, that being the case, I mean, obviously we're focused on a lot of the research questions that you are addressing in your role as a professor. But the other role that you've got is actually tied in with a governing body of sport. And I wonder if you just give a little bit of an overview as to the kind of why you took on the role in the first place, I suppose, and the specific challenges in research and innovation that the RFL are facing.
So the main reason I took on the role was I'm really passionate about people being able to apply knowledge as well as generate knowledge. And I'm also pragmatic in the fact that people who work in sport have very busy days, whether that's within the club or an organisation. And then as an academic, our world is do a study, write a paper, publish a paper, and then we get frustrated when people don't read our papers. So when you look at it from the other person's lens, the person in the club or within the governing body, and you look at the things that they deal with, why would they have time to read the papers that are being published at the rate that they are because of all the good work going on? So the reason I took on the role was to try and feed some of the knowledge that I could see as an academic back into the sport, but then also to do the opposite, which was to then understand what challenges the sport were facing and feed those back into academia, which are interesting, and we've got to be really pragmatic, because not everything that's a genuine real life problem can be solved easily through research. Some of those are contextual, and equally they're complicated and complex, and you know they're a lifetime of work to solve. But the more we could align those two, we call them systems, which is the organisations that's creating the questions and applying the knowledge versus the organisation which is generating some of the knowledge and also creating some of the questions, that would actually help the sport. But we've done it in a certain way that it's not been we haven't rushed. We've gone in to make sure that actually anything that gets asked, that before we go to answer it, we're really pragmatic around, again, if we get asked a question, the first thing that we provide back to the RFL is how long it'll take to find the answer. Now, sometimes that's too long. And if they have a really quick decision to make on something that maybe doesn't need a full research project, and you have the option of, okay, you can do it, we can go and do a study, but you'll find out in, you know, a year, 2 years, potentially 3 years with some big projects, and that allows them to be realistic on whether they do or don't go with that. Yes. Or the other option is, if they have a question, we go to the literature. And given the amount of literature out there at the moment, there's not usually the specific research question that they had, but we can start to speculate based on what's been done in other sports or in similar sports. We can speculate what the answer would be. And again, because it's a long process, it's more around making sure that, again, it's the wants and needs that we want systems in place that allow us to manage our data so that when a question comes up, we can answer it quickly. And it's not a case of when a question comes up, we have to go and find the data, organise the data, clean the data, analyse the data. By the time we go back, the question's not there. So we're almost, again, trying to second guess what the questions might be for when they are needed.
And I guess also within that role, I mean, for certain you are working on behalf of the RFL, on behalf of the governing body, but I'm guessing that you're also required to interface with key personnel within the Super League clubs as well. So strength and conditioning coaches, medics, and head coaches as well, I would guess. Do you find in the course of your conversations with those people that you're getting consistent questions coming back to you, or are they quite sort of localised and specific to the organisation?
I think that from a high level, everyone's interested in the same thing, which can relate to injury, performance, participation. Yeah. And they're the things that do come back. Now, how they're framed and how they're questioned are different from different organisations. because of our approach to the research and because it's new in this context, we've almost been very hands-off at times, and at no point have we posed questions to clubs. It's been more around, if you've got any research questions, we can help you answer them. So then because we wanted, at the moment what we felt was happening was, if you look at the literature in Rugby League, there's a phenomenal amount and there's some fantastic work, but I would say that the majority of it is driven by the academics doing Rugby League research, which means that despite the great knowledge, there's probably not as much application of that knowledge because people aren't aware of it in the clubs. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to support those that were doing the knowledge generation in the universities, which is the really high quality scientific studies, but then almost integrate more of a research culture and question from within clubs, so that they start understanding the research process, they become more confident with it, they become more comfortable with applying research, and then eventually the cycle will then mean that almost we'll call it the two systems then become closer. And some of those questions can be around, the physical characteristics of players, the game demands of different age groups, different levels, the training demands, which are all information and data that they collect anyway. Right. So it's a case of then supporting them to turn that into research, to go through the process of what is the research from the question to the recruitment, to the collection, to the analysis, to the conclusions, which then means that they become more comfortable then applying the work that's already out there.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like what you're saying is, going back to your earlier point, there's an awful lot of work being done to try and address the needs of the sport. Yeah. And we're only just moving into a situation where the channel is open for that dialogue with regards to the wants of the sport, i.e. being derived from the people who inhabit the sporting environment. Is there a danger, do you think, that there might be a little bit of a mismatch between the needs, or the identified needs, and perhaps the wants?
Yeah, possibly. And I think what we're talking about now is almost translational research, and that's not new. It's something that medical science has dealt with really well because of its challenges that it had before. So the translation of science isn't a new thing. But what we're trying to do, we're trying to apply things within a rugby league context. I think that the needs and the wants will always be different. The wants of a sport, when we understand the context around that, which is you look at things week to week because you're judged based on game outcomes. Yeah. Sometimes if you have a winning formula, you stick with it. You're not as interested in why that is a winning formula, you keep going with it. Yeah. So if that's your wants, and I come in with something that's a needs that potentially changes you away from your successful winning spree, I wouldn't do that if I was a coach. I'd stick with my formula. Yeah. So I think it's almost creating this virtual continuum, which is simplicity from research to complexity in research, and then it's also from the other way, which is from practice, which is I would class as interesting to useful, and we need, if we can slide along that continuum of things we need doing quickly, which we can do relatively straightforward, and examples that are validation studies. Yes. We can do validation studies in a weekend. If we're comparing something against something else, they're really easy to do, and actually that's something that can be fed back really quickly versus something which is a longitudinal dose response type study, which takes a long time to design, collect, analyse, feedback. So having that ability and allowing people to have that awareness of what is quick, what is long, in terms of the time course of the information feedback back. I think again it's all about making people comfortable with what research is and what it isn't. Yes, of course. Because I find at the times that people criticise research sometimes unfairly, and that would be around, I think simplistically you can class research into two boxes: knowledge generation or knowledge application. Knowledge generation would be something that in its purest sense would be, in a laboratory, would be reductionist, would be well controlled. And you can criticise that all day if it's practical application, because it doesn't have any. Its practical application is long term because we've created more knowledge. And then the knowledge application is almost, you can also call those efficacy and effectiveness. The knowledge application is then seeing if that knowledge applies to the real world. You can criticise that all day long for not contributing new knowledge. But actually, it's a fantastic way of seeing how that knowledge has or hasn't applied. Yes. So again, being really comfortable with what the aims of our studies are. Are they genuine knowledge generation, or are they knowledge application? And then we become more comfortable with where research fits within the bigger picture.
Ben, absolutely fascinating stuff. Real insight from a true applied researcher. I'm really grateful for you giving up your time this afternoon and coming in. And I wish you all the very best with all of these knowledge generation, knowledge application studies, and in trying to elucidate the wants of the sport of rugby league. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Cheers.